Right. Oh, wow. Okay.
All right, we're going to get started. I think we're competing with a football game.
Oh.
Introducing Graves. He's going to introduce himself.
Okay. Hey, y'all. My name's Ian Graves. I'm a resident of Prairie Village, city councilor in Ward 6. And so if you're not super familiar with the wards in Prairie Village, my ward is about south of 75th Street and east of Mission on down to about 83rd, but there's a little bit of overlap on the bottom of 83rd in a few spots. So I'm around the Hy-Vee, those neighborhoods, Somerset Hills, Meadow Lake, Talaferro Park, Weltner Park, those parks are all in my ward. Some of the interesting Drummonds that you see are in Ward 6. Yeah, that's kind of my background. I live with my wife and 3 kids. I think I have another introductory slide, so I won't stomp on my own slides, so we can go ahead and get going with this. So if you just want to start up the slides. Cool, and maybe it can stand over here so I can see a little better. So the title of the talk is Village and Housing Access. It's basically just a series of questions and conversations about how is housing access trended in Prairie Village, housing access being housing affordability, housing attainability, the accessibility of rental units for people who live and work here. One of the things that started this conversation, at least on the council side, was just a note that people who work in our schools, people who serve in the police department and fire department and work in our shops, they're steadily losing the ability to live amongst us in this community. And what should we do about that? What's our role to play as a city? And so this talk is just, this is a lot of, when I talk to my dad about giving this talk, he's like, Ian, you got to keep it to a tight 30 or people are going to get mad at you. So I'm going to try to keep it light and high level. But these are just a handful of thoughts I have on this and what we're working on and just the situation in general. So if you can hit next there, I believe. So I work in tech. And in most big tech companies, there's always this disclaimer at the very beginning, which is to say that I'm, in this case, only speaking for myself. I'm not pretending to speak for the mayor. I don't really have any inside ball for you on how this is progressing through the Planning Commission, other than what I've seen at the Planning Commission meetings myself. I do understand the process leading up to that, and I can speak to that a little bit, but I'm not speaking for another city councilor. I'm not speaking for city staff. I'm just speaking for Ian tonight. So next, please. My story, so I graduated from grad school at the University of Redacted in 2015. After that, I moved to Portland with my wife. I took a job at a notable semiconductor company based in Hillsborough that I usually omit the name, but the little jingle is doom, 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 doom. You might have heard of it. So we bought a home, we had our first child, and realized that living far from home was tricky. Our first son was very colicky. It was a rough go. We really loved Portland, but we really wanted to be near family. And I'd originally grown up in Lee Summit, but in that time my parents had moved to Prairie Village. And so we came back here and checked it out and thought it was a really neat area and a great place to raise a family. When we moved back, one of the reasons we were even able to afford the house that we live in now was because we lived in a hot market prior to this. When I lived outside of Portland in Hillsborough, and the amount of time I lived there, my home appreciated about 20%. And so we were able to bring that back with us, which we thought would go far in Kansas City growing up here. But it turned out it was pretty much enough for a down payment on the home we bought, which was a little disappointing, but at least we made it, right? We made it into the city we wanted to. So I consider us really lucky in our circumstances that we were able to, make that happen and be here amongst you all and amongst the community. So in 2019, I ran for council, focusing on rising housing costs, but largely in the context of the teardowns, which people in my ward were concerned about. So neighborhoods around Meadow Lake and Somerset Hills are not part of the teardown phase we've seen yet, but there's been some angst that eventually they will be torn down and replaced with much larger, expensive housing. So this was something I was interested in. Also, public investment more broadly. There had been talk at the time about the Civic Center, which is still being talked about, or incorporating a new library up in the Civic campus. Those are the kinds of things I'm interested in, is equity on housing and public investment. So that's kind of who I am in a nutshell. Don't hold it against me because I went to Mizzou, though. But, next slide, please. So, Prairie Village has been at this sort of confluence of a lot of economic factors. Teardowns have raised land values, which have raised property taxes, and the new construction that we see is never really affordable by any measure. It's always like, wow, a 2,500, I think I saw a 2,600 square foot home going for $960,000. Whoa, like wow. So, and when I first saw that, I'm like, oh, these builders, they're just building homes and they're marking them up and they're getting away with it, and that's crazy. Being on council a little longer has sort of changed my perspective on that. This is much more, housing development and redevelopment, especially in established areas, is much more of a numbers game, sorry. But the effects, despite being a numbers game, are real. They have human impacts. So people who live in my neighborhoods even are being squeezed on their property tax bills. They're being squeezed in that families can't move laterally in the village. Folks who are older, who want to downsize, are stuck because people who are living in the smaller houses can't afford their homes. So there's not really an intra-village movement. There's not a whole lot of liquidity for people to move around the village in line with their place in life. So, you would think apartment maybe, starter home, bigger home, maybe forever home, and then, forever home in the sense that you live the longest there, and then maybe something smaller when you're an empty nester. That process seems to have been disrupted by a number of factors that maybe I could enumerate some, but I'm not going to try. So like I said earlier, a lot of people who work here, who drive in here every day, who cause traffic coming here to work or cause traffic to leave, et cetera, they can't live here. And I think at the heart of a lot of this is just the way zoning is impacting the way we're redeveloping. And I'm not saying this necessarily to say that we have to fundamentally change everything, but we at least have to recognize the role that our existing land use ordinances play in the socioeconomic effects we're observing in town. And this isn't just a Prairie Village thing. This is a Johnson County thing. This is a Kansas City thing. So, once we observe a thing, I think it's just important to think about it, take stock of it, and then decide what, if anything, should we do about this as a city. So next slide. Let's see where I'm going with this. So just the basic graph, right? So according to census data, area household incomes for Kansas City is blue. It's gone up, considerably, and I stopped the data around 2020 because that's what I was able to pull down off the census. Gone up about 28%, with PV median incomes largely stable, 9%, right around 86 or 88,000 a year right now, median household income. And if you just go to the next slide, you'll see the problem, though, is that this is the Zillow housing index, which is not exactly a median number. It's more of kind of a thick channel around the median. They call it a typical home price is going for this. So it's not like half the prices are below this and half the prices are above this. This is like your typical home value if you're buying in Prairie Village. And between 2013 and 2020, it's gone up 60%. So wages have gone up some. Home prices gone up a lot more. Okay, so we're observing a situation where I think next slide enumerates this more. There's just many people are experiencing a loss of access to a community that they may not have been able to purchase and own in before and build wealth in that community. So, in 2013 or 2014, a household making the metro median income for the entire Kansas City metro had a pretty good shot at buying in Prairie Village. Somebody making the PV median income had, I'd say they had a shot at maybe 50 to 75% of the housing units in Prairie Village at the time, just, hand waving a little bit there. Fast forward to now, metro median income I don't have, there's a median. I could do standard deviations off of this and make everybody's eyes glaze over. But people who are making the metro median income, their opportunities to buy a home are largely evaporating or have evaporated in Prairie Village, either because the price on everything has gone up or because, what was I going to say? The price has gone up, or people who are in those homes priced at those rates, especially in my neighborhood, they know what they have. They don't want to move anywhere else. Why would I move? I love Prairie Village. I love being close to downtown. I live in a small home. I could get a bigger home somewhere else, but I'm close to downtown and the city rocks. I'm never selling this place. So that house is essentially locked in. Good. Yeah, I mean, if you love your house, don't sell it. But at the same time, we just don't have the liquidity and the pricing that we used to. So market effects are pricing a lot more people out of the market. And so rental rates in PV are a little bit harder to discern. They're not published, anywhere in particular like MLS data is. But you can sort of glean it from the Census ACS surveys. Every 5 or so years, they'll ask people, what are you paying to live in your apartment? And then they kind of do a gross median estimate of price per bedroom. And right now, those rates come in at around the area median average. So about $55,000 a year if you're spending a third of your income on rent, that's affordable to you. So a 1-bedroom is affordable if you're, you won't be housing stressed or housing poor if you're making 55 grand. So next slide. So then there's what we all know and we hear about a lot. It's been talked about a ton. The tear down bonanza, right? A lot of people, there's a lot of fingers pointed in various directions. Whose fault is it? Is it the builder's fault? Is it people selling to builders? Is it what? Builders are buying on spec. People are buying homes and speculating on the homes and then rebuilding until they find a buyer. We have a lot of aging housing stock in Prairie Village. You look at some of the houses around the village, some of them are on cinder block foundations. You get massive clay soil moving in and out against the foundation year after year after year. Some of those houses are more expensive to save than they were to build or rebuild in their current form. So I don't begrudge anybody for knocking down a house and building it. I don't begrudge anybody for knocking down a house and building a nice big house that they love. If you can do it, I mean, congrats. People love nice things. They love houses. So the problem, though, as I see it, is that the revitalization of our housing stock is only really being made available to a top socioeconomic strata. So that's great. We're getting new housing. The new housing is excellent. But it's so expensive that a lot of people who live here could never hope to afford those units. So what does that mean when we think about it? And just going back to the market and bidding process, you have speculators buying homes to sit on them, builders buying homes, sitting on them, maybe renting them out before they ultimately tear them down and rebuild on them. It just creates a bigger crunch for people trying to buy at what used to be the market rate, but really isn't the market rate anymore because there's large building groups, financed groups, private equity even at this point is involved buying homes en masse. And so the little bullet point at the bottom of this is that in about 90% of Prairie Village, a single home can only be replaced with a single home. So can you go to the next slide? Let's see where we're at. But why are the new homes so large? Why are they so big? Why are they so big? Well, it's actually just a numbers game, yet again. The market just balances equations. It doesn't have an agenda. It says, here's my price inputs, here's my price outputs. Can I find a buyer at the price output price? Cool, then I will make the product. What are the products I can bring to market? Well, zoning says I can bring one kind of product to market, and that's a single family home. So the equation then comes to, how do I knock down an existing home no one really wants to live in or needs knocking down? How do I replace that with a new home while turning an industry standard margin of around 15, 18, 20%? It's the standard. Again, nobody's doing this to lose money. This is capitalism. We don't expect builders to build things at a loss. It is what it is. So the costs, price of the land, price of the existing home. Even dilapidated homes have value. They have value. They can be lived in if they're mildly rehabilitated. Demolition, a small marginal cost, and then the construction of the new home. And then there's some financing constraints that come into play here. Financing a rebuild can be complicated. Nobody wants to say, nobody who's coming in all cash wants to knock down a home and then build a new home where they're underwater relative to market. So if I knock down a home, spend $750,000 building a home of the same size, but the home I built isn't actually worth the price of the original home plus a little bit, I'm actually just out money. I don't have equity in this thing. I'm negative equity. I'm underwater. And then there's other things like loan-to-value ratios and lender constraints on financing, like how much money is the land worth, how much money should your house be relative to the land. There's a lot of like technical wonky stuff I'm told by some of my friends who are near this stuff. So a lot of this stuff is just a product of how the system works. It's not somebody coming in with grand designs for Prairie Village saying, I'm gonna turn this place into like mansions everywhere. It's just the system. The system is working, how it has been laid out. It's a machine and it's operating more or less without a driver. The market is distributed and it operates how it does. So yeah, next slide. So this is a conservative building example just for picturing this, right? So say you have a tear down property and I scroll around Zillow or what have you, and 275 is like, I've seen homes that I would consider knockdown homes in that price range. Now, we're actually running out of homes, period, that are in this price range. We're running out of, the number of homes below the 300 level in Prairie Village have been in decline.
It's 40%.
Well, it is, but on market. Appraised, yes, but on market. So let's just say 275, you buy the property, then you take, you demolish it for some marginal cost, you build a 2,000 square foot home, about $250 a square foot, which is around, it's middle of the road, kind of lower end for builders. So then you have this new products, and that, I should say that 250 square foot also includes margin. I'm guessing there's margin wrapped up in that. So the new total is somewhere around $785,000. So what was, let's say 275 or 300,000 is now a home, maybe of a similar size or maybe a little larger, for 785. So this is just how the system generates new housing. So next slide, please. So the thing is the way zoning we have done here, it leads to more expensive rebuilds. And that's because the system was more or less built around using land that did not have significant value to build housing on originally. If you go down to, south of 200th, you keep going down Metcalf, you'll find empty lots that are relatively inexpensive, and you can build a house on them for a low marginal cost, just the cost of the home. Up here, we're looking at a situation where, no, the land is, well, for one, the land is not cheap because it's in demand, we're close to downtown. And two, there's a thing on it that's worth money. And so you have to buy that, you have to blow it up, then you have to replace it with something else. So what this does is it increases the floor cost of any new development in Prairie Village. That floor cost is higher. So everything must be built upon that floor and must be more expensive. But people who buy original housing or have lived here in original housing, they didn't have that floor cost. So this whole new thing that we're contending with is a new effect due to rebuilds plus, floor cost of rebuilding on zoned and developed lots. And this is true. This isn't a Prairie Village thing. This is true for most of the metro. There's not a whole lot of alternatives to this, barring a rezoning request for the lot. So if you can go to the next slide. So just to touch on that a little bit, so there's bending and changing the zoning rules. There's two ways generally you go about it. One is one that's brought up is asking for a variance in the zoning. And variances are not intended to change the use of the land. So if you have a single family R1 detached home on an R1 lot, and you ask for a variance, you actually can't ask for an ADU or something to house another person in. You're still limited to the original characteristics of R1. What you can ask for is things like, well, my lot's shaped weird, and I'm trying to get this fence right with my sidewalk, and I need to go over the easement here to line up my fence. Or my lot's big triangle, and the setback of my house isn't going to work in this one spot. So the extenuating circumstance. These things go to Planning Commission, you notify your neighbors. My neighbors built a fence that was a little bit closer to the street than I think was technically allowed. They notified everybody, and everybody kind of shrugged and said, build your fence, whatever. So that's kind of the sort of low touch bending of the zoning rules. And then there's the high touch, and that's full on rezoning. So we have different types of zoning. We have R1A, R1B, which are single family, R2, duplex, R3, apartments, garden apartments as they're called in Prairie Village, and R4, which are condos, row houses, that sort of thing. And so rezoning a property from, let's say, a layperson's perspective, let's say you have a budget of $750,000. It's expensive, it gets expensive, it's risky. You need lawyers, you need people who know the land rules, land use rules, you need people who know how to do all this stuff. They need to go and advocate for you at Planning Commission. Neighbors will have an opportunity to voice opposition. However, the opposition they voice by state statute is not binding either way. State statute actually protects builders over the opposition or support of neighborhoods. It's actually very odd. I mean, you served on city council, so you're probably familiar with the golden standards and how they say support or opposition is not enough in and of itself to really change a zoning request. It's 8 other things, many of which benefit builders. So these opaque legal standards, ironically called golden, maybe he who has the gold makes the rules in these cases, but that's actually somebody's name, it's a court case. So we have public participation, doesn't guarantee anything, goes to Planning Commission, council approval. Pretty high touch. So next slide. Let's see where I'm going to say. So rezoning, as you might guess, is for those who have the means to rezone and who have a project in mind that they intend to make good money on. So smaller upzonings, let's say I have a home, I have a $750,000 budget, I'm like, I want to build a duplex on my property. So I want to rezone to R2. And then I have to go through all these steps. I got to hire an attorney, I got to hire maybe an architect, we got to do up a plan, we got to call, the city, the neighbors may or may not have beef with this, we got to contend with that, have meetings. You're looking at months and months and months of lead time. Most people throw up their hands and say, this isn't worth it. The rezoning process cannot work for small scale developments. So smaller developers, by and large, structurally, are boxed out of this process. So what we end up seeing is single-family districts remain single-family districts because the weight of the system is sort of keeping them R1, except when you have a developer who has deep pockets. And then the game changes, and I'm sure all of you in this room have heard of the Mission Valley project, right? So a developer comes in, this is R1, developer can hire a lawyer, can hire one of those lawyers that knows every nook and cranny of the law, can go before a council and a planning commission, and can make all the cases according to the golden standards that you have to approve this. And remember, if a builder feels that they've been slighted according to the golden standards, they can also sue the city and win anyway. So this is it can be a very touchy process. And if a builder feels like that council has been unduly influenced by political pressure from the public, that's grounds for a lawsuit. There's a very strange thing I learned when I ran for council is when you deal with rezoning requests, the council is no longer a legislative body anymore. It's what the law calls a quasi-judicial, I can't say this, quasi-judicial body. And we have to think about the rules according to these standards and act as though we're judges and making our decisions in accordance with this set of standards. And we have to demonstrate that our reasoning is in line with these standards. So, larger developers have an advantage because they have the money. And if they have the money, they want to build a really big project, like, again, a Mission Valley, something like that, where there's a big paycheck waiting for them at the end if and when it succeeds. So what we end up with is we got a lot of R1, and then suddenly we get big R3 apartments abutting R1 in strange places. And that's because this is what the system sort of produces. So this creates a gap of housing types in communities, frequently called the missing middle. And the missing middle, you know, I'll link to this at the end of the talk because I don't really need to get into this, but it's basically missing middle housing is any kind of housing that is not single family, detached, or apartment buildings. So think courtyard concepts, duplexes, stacked duplexes, quads, all that stuff. All of that intermediate density is tossed out. We get R1 and we get big density. There's just, it's this bifurcation of density that occurs under these zoning regimes. So next slide. So, you know, and then there's just issues of legacy pieces of city code that benefit those with means and may not benefit those with less means. And this is an example. Prairie Village already allows a kind of ADU. It's called an ALQ, cute. It's an accessory living quarters. And it can be attached to a home. That's how it can be built. You can attach it to a home. It can be up to 30% of the footprint of the home. And that's cool, but who's allowed to live in those? Your family, or a live-in servant, but not renters, which is interesting because residents in smaller homes, and like neighborhoods like mine, they could, you know, I've actually had residents approach me and say, I'd really, you know, an ADU could like work for my family, we might be able to get a renter or something, like maybe that could be something we could try to help kind of support us paying off our mortgage, et cetera. But live-in servants can ostensibly be paid less because they've been given board, right? So folks who have means and can build an ALQ in Prairie Village can see some of that return back in lieu of rent, you know, that a person would normally be paying somewhere else to live. So if you're living in my unit, you know, I don't have to pay you as much because you don't have to pay housing costs. So this is just a thing where it seems inequitable. It doesn't seem quite right. So that's something I'm curious in seeing how we might be able to rectify. You know, I again, don't begrudge people who are able to do things and people who have means. But the same tools should be available to everyone because some of these tools can greatly benefit people at the lower end of the housing spectrum who are trying to make ends meet, they're retired, they're on fixed income, et cetera. This can benefit people in a lot of ways. Maybe your kids come home and live with you for a while, they move out of the ALQ and maybe you want to rent it. You know, there's a lot of opportunities that could be realized there. So yeah, next slide. So then, but what if there is like another way in all of this? And so this is kind of where I pivot a little bit to just the broader ADU concept. And this is sort of the thesis that I operate from, is that homeowners need additional tools to stay in place, house additional family, develop rental income if they need that to support themselves, house additional family in attached or maybe detached structures on their property. So it's a concept where we change the zoning rules to allow for additional building forms to exist, but we do it in a targeted kind of careful way where, in my opinion, we don't want to give an edge to big builders either. What we want to do is say, owners, here's something you can build onto your property, tools you can use. But if we were to say, oh, we can build quadplexes in R1, well then more builders are just going to come in and tear the place up and build quadplexes everywhere, and then the money still is being rented and leaving the community to REITs and everything like that. So incremental development is just this idea where homeowners, small people, small redevelopers, maybe even flippers can come in and make these adjustments to homes and neighborhoods to make them more financially viable for their owners. And these are also helpful tools to help us meet the crisis that we're in because it ultimately develops more housing inventory. So if you develop an ADU, for example, let's say you live over by, let's say I live near Belander, and you know there's a teacher looking to rent so she can walk instead of having to drive in from somewhere. And you're like, look, we got an ADU, like maybe we know you, you know, you can rent, you can stay here until you save up some cash to like get a down payment on a house somewhere, you can walk, you can be a part of the community. You know, these types of opportunities, sort of small scale, neighborhood integrated things, I'm really interested in. What I'm less interested in is just carte blanche, let's go ham and just build things everywhere. I'm not interested in that, though there are probably some spaces where we can think about existing R2 garden apartments and how zoning changes might help those be redeveloped and modernized. I know some of our apartment buildings may need safety modernizations, and in order to get those, we need to sort of rebuild them, and in order for them to be rebuilt, there needs to be a market incentive. So we have to enable them to maybe build a little denser or a little taller just to help them deliver a market product that is better for people who live there. So next slide. I think I just talked right through this slide. So yeah, accessory dwelling units. Another thing considered is smaller lot minimums. I don't know where this is gonna go. It was mentioned in the ad hoc housing proposals. You know, in places where there's R1B, we have, I think, a 6,000 square foot lot minimum. Don't quote me on that. R1A has a larger lot minimum. R1B has a smaller lot minimum. And what we see is in my neighborhood, I have R1A lots and R1B lots that are the same size. Like they're 10,000 square feet. And that's, you know, but the R1B lot still can't be split because it's, I think the lot minimum is probably right around 6, so you can't split that. But another way to lower cost floors would be to split a lot that's large and build 2 houses there that are smaller. You take the base cost, you divide that by 2, and you can build a smaller product to market, and then that's you know, attainable to more people. There's some other R1 style patterns. So Courtyard Patterns were mentioned, which is kind of like you have a shared lot with houses around it on a single lot. I don't know, you know, there's been some, you know, I think when I worked with John Burkle on the Planning Commission, he expressed a little trepidation with that because of the way Water One does metering. That may be challenging, so having multiple detached units on a single lot is like may not be kosher with how we do utilities, so that's something we got to study. It may not be feasible, it may just get tossed. Patio homes, I think, were also brought up by Nancy Wallerstein on the Planning Commission. I don't think those were mentioned explicitly, but we absolutely should consider those because seniors moving into patio home style arrangements where, you know, maybe the landscaping's taken care of, they're closer together, they can be amongst peers and friends, and move out of houses that are large and big for them, but keep them in the community because we don't want people to just be forced to move away because there's not housing stock for them. So that's the thought there. Next slide, please. So this is, I just threw this in as just some examples of ADUs. The top one was in Village Vision 2.0. Those look really fancy. One looks like an old carriage house on the right. And then on the middle 2, I believe those are 2 that are built above a garage. But then the AARP also has a big document about ADUs. I think it's called the ABCs of ADUs is what they call it. And there, you know, I spoke with some folks from the AARP who are very interested in just expanding ways communities might use this form because, I mean, you all know that the ADUs were frequently called granny flats or mother-in-law suites, right? And because that's what they were built for in many cases, so for elderly relatives could move into them. So it's a use that the AARP is really interested in bringing back. Moving to assisted living is very expensive, and moving to assisted living too soon is, you know, a life-changing cost. So these are things that we're interested in, they're interested in, you know, talking to cities about. So those are some of ideas. So like a detached, attached, an interior upper, above the garage, you can convert a garage. A lot of people in my neighborhood have actually just converted their garages into living space. If you drive down around Meadow Lake, there's just a lot of places where you think there should be a garage door, but one no longer exists. Maybe there's a window, maybe it's just a massing that doesn't fit, but it was a garage at one point. And then basement apartments. Would all of these forms fit in Prairie Village? I don't know. I don't know if they would or if they should, but you know, maybe some of them might, maybe some of them might relative to busy areas. Another thought that I talked about was perhaps ADUs don't fit broadly across Prairie Village. Perhaps they make more sense close to village centers like Hy-Vee, Village, and Corinth, where we have employees working in those stores that might be able to get cheap rent in one and they could walk to work, thus cutting down traffic and meeting a handful of other city goals. Like people are able to live here, kind of work here, and enjoy life here. You know, ADUs might be a means to that end. Yeah, so next slide, yeah. So, you know, housing alternatives, they benefit both renters and owners. You know, we can't just throw up an apartment somewhere. We're not going to rezone a neighborhood for apartments for a number of reasons. One, it would be politically untenable. People would be very unhappy about that. I mean, a lot of folks are already very concerned about talking about single family, and I think there's a lot of legitimate concerns there. So, you know, small-time homeowners can build additional spaces to help meet some of these housing unit needs that the entire metro needs to be leaning in on. You know, there are some places where apartments may eventually make sense. I can think of a few off the top of my head, but I don't know. It really depends on what a developer approaches us with. I don't decide where apartments go or, you know, how apartments get redeveloped. But the question right is why focus on single family? And it's because it's 90%. And if we just move the needle a little bit, maybe not in a very intrusive way, that could help a lot of people out inside of Prairie Village, and it may even be in such a way that people don't really notice. It's really up to the Planning Commission to kind of decide how neighborhood impacts, and they're very good at that, these changes could entail. Yeah, so next slide there. So just the higher density zonings. These are less interest, but I'll just mention them. The R2 zoning is a funny one because we have it, but I think we only have 4 acres of it in Prairie Village, and all those acres are right behind the Corinth shops. If you go up Somerset, behind the Corinth shops, that is all of our R2 zoning. There may be like one duplex somewhere else in town, but that's it. So what can we do with those? Can we lift the restriction off of a duplex and make it a triplex? Like, what kind of forms can be allowable in the districts that already have duplexes? R3. The big thing here is that our apartments are currently limited in how dense they can be, aka how many units can be built into an apartment by the lot size they sit on. And I believe that density is 1 housing unit per 2,500 square foot of lot. So if you had, say, an apartment on a 10,000 square foot lot, which isn't a thing, but if you did, you could only have 4 units on that lot. I mean, does that make sense? Especially if we're trying to rebuild an old structure? Probably not. The finances don't line up. So how do we adjust that? Is there another number? Or in the case of more modern forms-based approach, you know, is there a way we can just say, okay, we're taking the density requirements off. However, we're gonna create a forms-based code that relates it to its surrounding neighborhoods in terms of height. There's height limitations relative to what's around it, et cetera. So that's kind of where forms-based codes comes in and talks about apartments. R4 is funny. We've got a bit of R4. We have some R4P, which is planned R4 districts. So like they're districts that are like that, but they're planned and they can't really be altered much. But I think for those, if we have any, you know, regular R4 districts, you know, how can we keep owner-occupied districts, encourage that development, and how can we, you know, enable market-based delivery of those products in the R4 district more? Are there any, you know, are we inhibiting density or something that can deliver a market product at a decent rate? So that's sort of the other higher density zonings. Let's see, it's the next slide here. So really, you know, there's some human benefits to a lot of this. You know, a number of studies have shown things like better health outcomes, when people have access to housing, better, and that access to housing is more secure. You're not house poor living in housing. You know, we have a lot of climate goals in Prairie Village. Any kind of density, reduction in driving, reduction in energy use with modern insulated buildings all lean into those goals. Racial equity, access to attainable housing just is a touch point for that. I think, you know, there's been some talk about how there's, you know, people bring up J.C. Nichols and the racist deed restrictions. Of course, those have been nullified, right? People of color can move here. The trouble is the systemic, you know, the systems that created Prairie Village are also the systems that created redline neighborhoods, which have sort of kept a lot of people in those communities from building the wealth they would need to move here. And I can't say we can't solve that problem. I'm just saying that more attainable housing, just a touch point on that problem. That we would be positively, it would be a potential positive impact. I don't know how I could, you can't just direct people of a particular race to buy a house, but just the existence of the stock is helpful.
Isn't that offensive to the people that
Let's
of
hold
color?
Okay. The other angle to that is folks that, so here's another thing that has come up is communities on the other side of state line, a lot of people who work here in Johnson County commute from there, and they drive down our streets. They drive down 75th, they drive down major thoroughfares to get to work. They're doing a lot of driving jobs. Things that have come up in the past have been, our police pull over a disproportionate number of people of color. And people ask questions like, why is that? Why are they targeting people? And I would say, I don't, knowing the police department that I do, I don't believe that they're targeting anybody. I think what we're seeing is a result of the results of redlining from a long time ago. Those people live over there, they drive over here to work, and the most common way to interact with a police officer is to drive on the road and be pulled over for some reason. Everyone speeds down 75th and gets, folks get pulled over all over the place. And so what if, just because of where they're located, they have to drive through places at disproportionate numbers? That's another systemic thing that comes to my head, like just the way that we don't live amongst each other and communities have to move through each other to go other places, has these knock-on effects. So, the next one, diffusing property tax costs while property values rise. If you have an ADU, if you have other means of income, we can also be looking at lowering property taxes. But I would just posit that if we eliminated the city entirely, your property tax bill would drop maybe 16%. So now there's a whole other question of is the Johnson County Appraiser's Office doing their job right? And people have very strong feelings about that, and I'm not going to get into that because I'm not that guy and that's not my job. Regardless of those issues notwithstanding, smaller lots and ADUs enable either smaller property tax bills and easier to pay property tax bills, or just more ways to fund living in a home through rents. And then the last one is really important too, multi-generational living. You can sort of accomplish this with our existing ALQ regime, but we actually don't allow detached ALQs. We allow detached accessory structures, but they can't be lived in. So you can build like a garage in your backyard or a pool house, but it can't be a living space. Next one. I think we're getting really close. So there's been a number of critiques and concerns, and school overcrowding is a really big one. It's one I think about. I have 3 kids. I have one in Belander. It's getting tight. So a couple things I would say to that is small units like I'm really kind of big behind don't generally result in children. Children don't live in accessory dwelling units because those are intended as more or less studio apartments. Those are either older folks or younger folks who are single or don't have kids to bring to the district anymore. The other part of this is that our school crowding problem, I mentioned Mission Valley yet again, is a result of a couple different things. One was I believe, coming out of 2008 and the policies out of Topeka that sort of defunded our schools resulted in cost cuttings all across districts. Districts had to close schools whether or not they made the right choices. Hindsight's 2020, I wasn't there. I didn't have to make those calls. That said, we have fewer schools now than we did. But our demography is now reverting to the mean. We have a larger number of empty nesters and seniors in this community, and eventually those people will age out of their homes, and younger families will buy their homes, and they will have children, and the average household size will increase, and that's all going to go to the schools again. So you know, the school question is going to have to be addressed one way or another. We used to have 6,000 more people living here, by the way. We used to have about 28,000 people in 1970. You know, the average house size has decreased, but it's unusually low right now relative to the national average. And it will go back up, and we're going to have to address the school issue. One will be partitioning, redrawing boundary lines, and the other will be our schools need to be built larger yet again, or we need to build new schools. We've knocked down at least 2 schools to replace them with retirement homes. The schools, again, they were sold. Retirement homes were used for those spaces. But what are we going to do about that? It's going to be a problem either way. So what are we going to do? It's kind of an orthogonal problem to the one, at least I'm thinking about here. Property values, smart intensification, there's a number of studies on this, and I can share them. They can boost property values. Better use of land in terms of efficiency, tax efficiency, more people gunning for smaller property that's still selling at pretty decent prices is a boost to the original housing stock that's already there. So is this market interference? I've heard that one. And I guess you could make the case, the problem is that housing markets aren't really free and they're constantly interfered with by a number of governmental factors. Housing isn't really fungible. You can't trade a house for another house. You know, I suppose, but at the same time, we have to be looking at this from a human, a humane perspective as well. Like, how are people being harmed by the existing system, and is there some middle compromise we can find that balances the both? Property rights, this is an interesting criticism I've heard, and this is, it's based around the idea that rezoning, which by the way, we're not rezoning technically, what we're doing is, and this may be considered semantic muddling by people, but we're not rezoning, we're actually just changing forms that are allowed in existing standards. So we're not taking an R1 and making it R2, we're not looking at that. We're taking R1 and saying, maybe you can build another ADU in it, maybe there's something else that works in that space. So the process, as I mentioned earlier, residents have a procedural point in which they can voice their concerns, their criticisms, their oppositions to whatever happens to a variance or a rezoning. But in both of those cases, those aren't really, it's hard to envision those as necessarily rights because they can't really halt a process. So on the flip side, if you're telling residents that they can build something extra or something different in terms of form on their existing property, is that not an expansion of property rights? Is this all a zero-sum game? I don't know. That's something we need to continue talking about. I understand, not wanting your neighbor to drag a mobile home and park it in their backyard and let it get all rusty. Like, we don't want to do that. We want to have, housing that lives up to the, standards and exterior guidelines that we've laid out for the city that keeps it a high value and nice place to live. And I think we can do that for some of these accessory buildings. We need to be careful, and the Planning Commission was very careful when they did the exterior guideline changes too. So I view this as sort of an extension of that, but for accessory style units. Next slide. So where are we going from here? So the Ad Hoc Housing Committee was formed. I co-chaired it. We created an aspirational set of priorities for council staff and Planning Commission to consider. None of that was binding. We chose from a couple lists. Village Vision 2.0 was the city plan we used. And then we chose from UCS, United Community Services of Johnson County. The committee essentially took those items in a list and rank ordered them based on voting, and then produced a document at the end that said these are our recommendations, and it was a synthesized form of those ranked order voting items that we chose. City Council met and said, we feel like these are worth considering at Planning Commission, and the vote was unanimous to move it there. I think what the expectation of council then was that, and I mentioned it when I talked, already over 30, oh my goodness, I'm over 30 minutes. That talk went 75 minutes. I mentioned that, these are aspirational. The Planning Commission is going to need to whittle these things down. And they will. I fully expect them to just toss items out of that list because they're the ones that know what works. They have concerns about parking. They have concerns about traffic. They have concerns about stormwater. It could be that they toss out all kinds of things we recommended because they're the experts. I'm not going to proceed to tell them what to do. They're builders, they're engineers, they're architects. This is their area. We picked from these aspirational items and said, man, we think these are good ideas to look at. Can you guys look at this? Council agreed, and so they're looking at it. They're going to take a series of forums, public forums, 3 to 6 of them over the next, I want to say, 6 to 8 months. Staff came up with a draft timeline. They decided it was too short. I think they're right. I think that extending the process as long as possible is fine. I'm not in any rush to do anything. You want to get it right. You don't want to go headlong into something and be like, oh dang, that was really bad. I want people to be able to express their opinions and then kind of hear the Planning Commission's feedback, and we can do this. We can have this conversation. So after review public forums, PC will sort of come into a more technical set of standards. Like, this is what we believe. It'll be in terms of setbacks, massing, or they'll say that none of this works by, that could be a result from the Planning Commission. And in that case, I wouldn't see council trying to just write its own ordinances at that point. We're not qualified to do that. So it could be, a lot of suggestions through this process. It could be a few suggestions. It could be, don't touch it. So that's where the process currently is. So next up. So what are we going to do? So, this is just kind of like, my open question. What are we going to do? It's a national problem. It is a national problem. The housing crisis is caused by state level and federal level decisions about housing policy. But unfortunately, it's left to the local level. And like many other things lately, things have fallen all the way downhill to not the state level, not the county level, but the local level to address. So what are we going to do about it, if anything? So we're kind of at the point in our history where we're going to decide, what do we want to be? What do we want to be relative to this crisis? Who do we want to position ourselves as? Who do we think we are? Who should we be? And so what will we be? What will we do? I think there's one more slide after this. Oh yeah, so feedback. Council members at pvkansas.com. You can also go to pvkansas.com. The contact information's all there. Love the feedback. Next slide. So, and this is sort of a reach. So beyond Prairie Village, and this is not what I'm thinking here, but zoning reform, for market rate housing is good, but it won't be enough to solve the housing crisis. We do what we can at the local level, but it won't be enough. The county needs to take a bigger role in housing. And, from where I'm sitting is we have a big wait list of renters, looking for housing choice vouchers. I can't, I want to live in Johnson County. I work in Olathe. I can't commute from Kansas City. There's just no stock for me. What do I do? And in my opinion, the county needs to get out of the game. I'm not trying to reach out to any county commissioners that might attend this church, but the county commissioner needs to get out of the game of playing favorites with developers approaching them and asking for benefits, and into the game of land trust, social housing developers, and a proactive approach, capitalizing new house construction for people with these needs and just mixed income situations. That's my personal opinion. Because Prairie Village, we don't have the space for a lot of this stuff, but the county does, and the county has the money, and the county is tasked with social welfare at the county level much more than we are. We have limited space and limited means. They have a much larger budget. So housing access, it just has a ton of touch points. It touches everything. Systemic oppression, raising access reduces the impacts felt by the poor and the marginalized. I mean, we gotta get people in houses, and the more we do at various levels, leaning in, lowers the pain at the bottom. It lowers homelessness. It gets fewer people, it leaves fewer people on the street. So, what I view this as is I'm not trying to solve the world's problems in Prairie Village, but what I am trying to do is say, what part do we play in this? Even if it's a small part, we have to at least think about it. So, I believe that is the last, I think, the questions. Oh no, interesting resources, right. Strong Towns, very good book. The Bottom Up Revolution to Rebuild American Prosperity is a lot about incremental redevelopment and dealing with how to evolve existing cities and neighborhoods. Missing middle housing is just the concept of missing middle housing, and then the AARP does the ABCs of ADUs and how they may look and how they might be utilized. So with that, I believe the next slide is the end. There we go. All right. Cool.
All right. Oops. We'll take questions if there are any. Okay.
So when I was reading the ad hoc committee's recommendations, the very first line says, to allow quality, attainable housing, especially middle housing by right in more zoning districts in the following ways, and then it goes on. The way I understand by right, that means that takes away a homeowner's right to protest a zoning change, right? Kind of like you just mentioned about the people around Mission Valley.
So they did protest, though.
No, but the term by right in this means that a Prairie Village resident would lose that ability.
So by right in that context means that new building forms would be available by right to somebody trying to build them. So like an ADU by right.
But I as a resident could not protest like the people around Mission Valley did.
You could go to city council about it.
But that's what that's saying, by
Yeah,
right.
that is what it's saying. It's saying it becomes an administrative change in the law where.
I just wanted to make sure that's what it.
That's what it means. Yes. Okay. Yes.
Anyone else?
For a very long time, the big developers had the benefit of extremely low interest rates. And just in the very recent past, Mr. Powell has kind of changed that calculus. How do you see that affecting what you've been talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not some kind of qualified macroeconomic guy, but it sure seems like in terms of, there's a couple things that'll happen with this. The Fed is obviously raising interest rates in response to what it believes is inflation, which of course we are seeing inflation, but it's raising interest rates to curb inflation. And interest rates curb inflation by essentially sucking money out of the economy. The problem where this is going to be really exacerbated is that interest rates from the Fed are prime drivers for new home financing, home construction of anything. And one of the biggest points of cost inflation is rents and housing. So what we're going to see is perhaps this counterproductive thing where, yeah, maybe the CPI drops, but housing is still going, new housing construction is going to be set back. So I think in response to that, again, smaller redevelopment might still remain viable, but yeah, it's going to slam the brakes on a lot of bigger apartment buildings. I mean, not here, obviously, but like it's going to slam the brakes on a lot of redevelopment that would have resulted in more housing units that we need. We've fallen behind after a couple different boom-bust cycles that have laid out builders. We're not building enough housing, and then so cranking up interest rates is going to chase buyers out of the market, and it's also going to chase builders out of the market because they can't finance anything on spec. So, yeah, it's not great. Raising the interest rate for this is gonna hurt folks who want to get more housing built. And I'm optimistic again that small scale stuff is more viable in these environments. But I don't think that big, huge neighborhood redevelopments are going to be quite as successful when we've got a 6%, 7%, 8% interest rate. So, it's tough.
Anyone else?
I see everything I am in what you're talking about. I'm a single homeowner, no kids, and, excuse me, and I look at things like Mission Chateau, Meadowbrook. I'll never be able to live in that kind of place. And I also look at the comments that come from, let's say, Brookside, watch out. The old sewers are now wearing out, et cetera, et cetera. And even when we bought in Prairie Village, there was a comment about the sewers down around the village were cardboard. Okay, so if these people come in, are we paying the taxes to have all of the infrastructure redone? I'm not impressed with, I feel like you're talking about, the force that was put on people to let so much of Meadowbrook go into a development. The same, my neighbors had signs out opposing Chateau Mission. I like living in Prairie Village. I don't want to be the last old person living here, but and I love hearing kids on my street, but I still don't see where people like us fit into all of this. I really don't want to move out, but if I had to live somewhere else, I couldn't live in Prairie Village. That's for sure. So.
Yeah,
And I don't want to, I'm going to say too, I'm on the fence. I don't want to have people priced out of living in our area, but I like it being a residential area. Heaven forbid that more of those private equity people would come in, or let's say 91st and Lamar. There's a big complex that was nice when it was built, but I don't want to see that happen here either, where it keeps being deteriorated. And I'm already thinking, how long is it going to take till what happened in Old Overland Park starts deteriorating, as people that they attracted as young singles or early marrieds say, this is not enough space for us with kids, and so they go south or west, and I don't want to see my area deteriorate like that. And so where does this all fit?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think the question around deterioration, especially of rental properties, is a salient one. I think the economic model is to build it, attract renters, and rent it, and rent it, and rent it, and rent it, and then when it's finally erect, rebuild it, or sell it to someone who will rebuild it. And that's not great for the community. It's not great for the renters. It's undignifying to people to live in a deteriorating apartment. I think there's probably more the city could do to try to stay on top of that. I think another thing is that when you look at, and I'm sorry, I'm just going to be a broken record on the ADU ALQ thing, is that when you have owners living in a home that is also renting to someone else, the whole the situation changes a little bit, because the owners are interested in maintaining their home even if they do have renters. Also, I am much more interested in housing forms and designs that are owner-occupied, whether they be more detached, R1, or whether we look at like, oh, maybe we could get some row homes in here. I know Mission really recently did the row home thing, and those were build to rent. And I think just back of the napkin math, those could have been attainable had they been sold to own, and there could have been a small homeowners association amongst those where people could live and own and be in attached housing. We don't have a lot of that here. I will say though that folks can't rent an ADU, but they can sell their house to someone who will rent the whole house, which has worse implications for traffic, parking, and the deterioration problem. When you mention infrastructure, yeah, the city's been making big capital improvement project investments every year. We're doing pretty good. One of the advantages Prairie Village has over a neighbor like Overland Park or even in Olathe, or where I come from, Lee Summit, is that we're not really stretched out. You know, you hear a lot of talk about things like chip seal in Overland Park. People hate chip seal. Oh my goodness. Oh, somebody's shaking their head back there. Part of the reason for that is they got a lot of roads to maintain because they are spread out. And when you spread out, you got more road mileage per capita, and that means either everyone's going to have to pay more taxes to keep those roads nice, or we're going to have worse roads. And so in the case of Prairie Village, our existing level of density supports a lot of our infrastructure fairly well, albeit at a fairly relatively high mill rate, you know, to continue our capital investments. But it's an important point you bring up, and you know, another thing about, you know, people living in an existing R1 or R2s is a lot of cases you're not really taxing the existing infrastructure because you're only adding one unit there, one unit here. And it's something that utility companies can keep up with when they're doing their regular capital improvements. So yes, and I also, you know, when I went to talk about sprawl, I remember developments when I was in college that would occur at the edge of town in Columbia, and they'd be all the way out there, and then the city would have to run everything out to them, and it was a huge capital overhead, and then that stuff starts to deteriorate. Maybe the developer helps you at the beginning, but when time comes to pay the piper, and you got to support that infrastructure. So we're lucky, we're a little luckier because we don't have isolated parts of town that are kind of off by themselves. When we do capital reinvestment in infrastructure, we're touching a lot at once, a lot of service at once. So, but those are all important questions, and when we talk about big projects and rental occupied projects, those are something that I think we should be directly addressing. How is this going to be 30 years down the road? So, for instance, with, was it Kenilworth down off 95th and 95th and Mission, right? It flipped over, redeveloped, everything got way more expensive. It would have been nice if the city had some kind of role maybe in asking, like, what's your plan to, like, you know, have some kind of continuation and level out rents so we're not repairing the whole thing at once and then all of a sudden, you know, dramatically increasing the rents and turning over all of our residents. We don't, you know, renters are residents. They are part of the community. And maybe they don't own land, but if they live in a place for that long, it's a loss to the community when they've been forced out. And so I think these are all really important questions we need to think about, especially around rental units. And I didn't come equipped to address all the answers, nor do I have all the answers, but you're raising very good questions. So I appreciate it.
What I don't understand is I keep hearing about people are afraid because of this rezoning. Could you talk about, I mean, I don't know, am I in R4, am I in R3, or should be I afraid that you're going to come in and rezone my lot to R2? I don't understand all of that.
What kind of house do you live in, if you don't mind my asking? Single family home? Then you're in R1. You're an R1A or R1B, one of the two.
Well, what does that mean?
So basically what those are, well, R1 just means single family, one, residential one. Single family. And so when folks say rezoning, you know, it's a saying under the belief that if we change codes on those existing zones, the zone districts like R1, then that's tantamount to rezoning. That's the position of that camp. You know, it's a matter of semantics. You know, we're technically not rezoning. We already have done this process before when we allowed chicken coops, backyard chickens. We had to change the zoning codes to allow backyard chickens in Prairie Village. Did we rezone Prairie Village when we did that? I don't know if that would be a fair assessment. We didn't change everything to R2, we just allowed chickens. So it's not really, in my opinion, reasonable minds can differ, a rezoning. It's a change of what forms are allowed in existing zones. And that's a lot of gobbledygook, but it's basically what it is we're not saying that a giant house can be, a giant duplex necessarily could be built next to you. We're saying that something at shape and scale can be built, should be built. That's what I'm saying. This is my opinion on it. So, yeah. We're not wanting to throw down quadplexes in the middle of a neighborhood, or we don't want to throw down large buildings in the middle of established districts. Those would require an actual rezoning, which is a lot of work and a lot of public feedback, and they happen one at a time, basically. So there's a couple different, in the city plan, sorry?
Just repeat the question.
Oh, so what do I consider affordable housing? My mic's still on. So I'll reference the city plan on this, but we have two different definitions. Affordable would be for, and these terms are conflated, so I apologize. Attainable, let me start with attainable. Attainable housing would be housing that can be afforded by someone making 80 to 120% of metro area median income. So that's $55,000 a year. That would be attainable housing. That's the definition in the city plan. Affordable would be less than 60%. Right now, we don't have a lot of either. We have what we have. So when the city plan references these concepts, it's asking, it's laying out a set of definitions saying this is what we consider to be affordable housing, workforce housing. Some people might consider that subsidized housing in some cases. And then there's attainable housing, which is intended to be affordable at market rate for people making 80 to 120%.
All right, I think we're going to bring it to an end. I want to remind everyone that this is being live streamed, so if you know anyone that has questions about this, I would encourage them to come to the Asbury website and they can listen to the process. And I want to thank Ian so much for coming and sharing, and I'm sure he would be open to questions later. And please stop for cookies and coffee on your way out.
I have cookies.
Thank you.
Thank you.